Hey, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Tim. That is well deserved, and we are going to miss you. Hopefully, not too much, but somebody will be around once in a while. Hey, I'm honored to be able to to introduce our featured speaker, our keynote speaker for today, and is somebody that you probably know the name of, but maybe have not heard or met before. Maybe to understand a little bit about Bryant Christie is. It's a firm that it's been referred to this morning when the Blueberry talks. Bryant Christie's name came up a lot. It's BCI, Bryant Christie Incorporated. They are a firm based in Seattle and Sacramento that does a lot of export assistance for agricultural and food crops. They are really a prominent resource, and a lot of ag groups use them, including our Raspberry Commission and our Blueberry Commission. And it's been headed and formed by one of the partners, Bill Bryant, and is the Bryant and Bryant Christie. Bill is here in the Seattle office. We are honored to have him as our keynote today to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world and how berries might be fit into exporting and so forth. Bill's been around now, been working on this since the late 80s in the Seattle area, and established a big organization called Bryant Christie. He's also ran for governor a couple years ago, and we gave it a very good run, very close. So he's very involved in the civic side of this country. He's been on the Port Commission in Seattle for many, many years. So he understands a lot about the trade world, and especially about the ag world here in this area. And I also will mention, I think Randy Hunkoop's son is working for Bill in Jess, and so he's very well connected here to the berry world as well. So help me welcome Bill Bryant.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I jumped at the opportunity to come talk to you all about a lot of the international issues that are affecting the berry industry and our berry exports. As was mentioned, I actually have started working in agricultural trade issues in the 1980s in the Reagan administration. Everybody remembers the Reagan administration. But it seems like yesterday, but it was a while ago. And but my connection to the berry industry actually goes back much further, because when I was, how old, Glenn? 12, I picked berries for Glenn Aldridge in Mossy Rock. I was born in Morton. Mom and dad are from Mossy Rock, and we lived in Hoodsport, and it was just natural to shove me off onto my grandparents in Mossy Rock every summer and go down and pick berries with Glenn, and that's how I earned the money to buy my first bike. So my involvement in trade goes back to the 1980s. My involvement with berries goes back even a bit further than that. I don't have a real big speech for you today. What I do have, though, is a lot of information on what's going on in international trade, particularly on issues that are very specific to blueberries and raspberries. And so what I want to do is just kind of run through those issues that we are confronting, those of us who are trying to export fresh and processed raspberries and blueberries around the world. And I can tell you that this is a very challenging time to be doing trade. I mean, I was involved in the Reagan administration on international trade work. I worked with the Bush administration negotiating NAFTA, with the second Bush administration, the Export-Import Bank. I've been doing this for a while. I have never been in an international environment where everything is so uncertain. And for the most part, the uncertainty does not directly affect berry exports. We work for the soybean industry. If I were back in St. Louis right now and talking to soybean growers, they're in the middle of it. And they have put in crops and acreage for the Chinese market that's now being taken away from them because of a lot of the trade disputes that are going on. They're in the thick of it. We in the berry industry are not necessarily in the thick of it. In many ways, we're kind of skating underneath the radar. If we were right now having to ship fresh berries to China, yeah, we'd be in the middle of it. If we were dependent upon the Chinese market in the way the soybean industry is. Because as a result of a lot of the disputes going on right now, the tariff on US blueberries into China is at 70%. That would kill a market. But since we don't have a market, there's nothing really to kill. But what we have to bear in mind is while the tariff wars that are going back and forth right now don't have a direct impact on us, This atmosphere of uncertainty directly affects a lot of other negotiations that we have going on. And so while it might not show up in the tariff numbers that are being bounced around, it's having a direct impact on our ability to open up new markets for fresh and processed product. So really, at the end of the day, uncertainty is the enemy of market expansion. And that's what we have to keep in mind. There are political events going on right now. The president is on his way to Argentina, where he will be meeting with Chinese and other leaders. Those are events that have an effect on a lot of the negotiations that we have underway with a lot of countries where we want to export fresh and processed berries that we can't control. As a company, and as a company that works with you and a lot of other industries, we have to be prepared for whatever comes up, and we have to have plans on how we can deal with it so we can continue to move our agenda forward depending on what comes up. But we can't control a lot of that political environment. But there are a lot of issues that affect the export of blueberries and raspberries that we can control, and that we can take advantage of opportunities to open up new markets. And so I don't want this to be a real negative downer of a presentation. There's a lot of good news out there. There are good things moving forward on the trade front. And we just have to continue to kind of fly below the radar on a lot of this uncertainty and be as aggressive as we can where we can make a difference and aggressively open up markets and create certainty where that opportunity exists. And that exists in two areas: in chemical residue standards around the world and in quarantine standards. So most of what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is talk to you about some very specific issues that are occurring in markets around the world on chemical residues and on quarantine that we're working on, and that if we're successful, and in many cases we have been, that can result in opening up new export markets for fresh raspberries and blueberries. And the first issue that I want to talk about are chemical residue standards. This is an issue that when I started working in agriculture wasn't even an issue. And it really is a matter that has come to the forefront in the last 10 years. I will bet that 10 years ago at BCI, we probably spent maybe 5 to 10% of our trade policy time on chemical residue issues. And I bet you today it's well over 60 to 70% of our time. Now, why is that? Well, one, high-value products are actually being exported around the world in volumes they weren't 10 or 15 years ago. And that's largely because around the world, we've had an explosion of the middle class. And in markets where we didn't used to export products, we are now exporting high-value horticultural products. And that's because we have middle-class consumers in these other countries that want a variety of food from around the world, and they want higher quality products than they can get at home. But as these middle-class communities rise, so does their concern about food safety. And so they want to know what's in their food. How has it been treated in a way that they would never have thought about 10 years ago or 15 years ago? 10 or 15 years ago, those countries would have deferred to the UN standards, what we call Codex. Codex has UN standards for food safety, and if you don't want to develop your own standards as a country, you can defer to the international standards. And that's what most countries did. But with the rise of this middle class, now these consumers are saying, well, we want to know what's in our food. We want you to be our government. We want you to be monitoring it. And by the way, why don't we have our own standards? And so countries are now not deferring as much to the international standards, but they're setting up their own national standards. And that means that if we're going to be exporting products, we have to be monitoring the changes in these chemical residue standards that are being developed all around the world. And without exaggeration, there are hundreds of new standards every week. Countries are developing new standards on new active ingredients all the time. In just the last few years, Taiwan, Canada, the European Union, Japan, China, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Vietnam have all revised their national standards. And most of those revisions are still going on right now. They're continuing to implement new standards every week. Well, if you want to be exporting products around the world, particularly high-value products, you've got to be monitoring those standards because they're going to be monitoring what's in the product when it comes to imports. And this affects high-value, fresh and processed products much more than it affects the bulk commodities like soybeans. They have fewer chemicals they're working with or concerned about, whereas in horticultural and high-value products, we have a number of active ingredients to be concerned about, and the governments are testing for each of those. Not only are they developing their own standards and their own testing, but they're investing in new facilities, lab facilities, so they are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to track these chemical residues. And if you get caught, the consequences can be really severe. Last January, there were 60 containers of potatoes that were kicked over in Korea for a violation of a chemical residue standards. Not 60 cases, 60 containers had to be destroyed or re-exported. That's a hit. There wasn't an actual problem with the health and safety of it. The government acknowledged that it wasn't probably dangerous or unhealthy. It's just that those potatoes had a chemical residue that was perfectly registered and legal in the United States, but had not yet gotten on the Korean list. This summer, I worked with it wasn't a berry product, it was very similar to a berry product, processed product, in Finland, where it arrived with a chemical that was legal in Europe, but Finland had not yet put it on their list, and it should not have been there. And it took us 3 weeks. We got the load released, and fortunately it was a processed product, not a fresh product, or we wouldn't have been able to have a product left after 3 weeks in July. But it was sitting at the airport in a refrigerated facility, and after 3 weeks and a lot of expense, we got the load released. But the failure to comply with the foreign standards that are changing all the time, can have real negative consequences. So what I want to do is just to run through some of the markets that right now are changing their chemical residue standards on berries, and just give you a real quick update on what's going on. The first is Korea. And Korea is a good news story, which is not something in international trade you ever hear. You never hear anybody saying Korea is a good news story, but for berries, at least on chemical residues, it is. It wasn't a year ago. Korea has decided to change its chemical residue standards. Like I was saying, a lot of countries had done before, they had really deferred to other standards. Now they are developing their own national standards. In October of 2017, so a year ago, they issued one of their very first lists of the chemical residues that were going to be approved for use in Korea. There were 3,000 chemical residue standards on that list. None, 0, were for berries. So we had a problem, because that would have affected the processed market there and our ability to develop more of a fresh market there. So BCI began working with the Korean government, with the US government, getting them data on berries, working with the registrants to make sure that they provided the research and the data the Korean government needed. And within a year, by October of this year, 93% of the chemical residue standards that we need to export berries to Korea is in the approval process in Korea. There are 83 that we would like. We have 77 of them pretty secure. I'm confident that 47 of them will be finalized, we hope, this month, and that the other 33 will be completed before 2022, when the regulation goes into effect. But it's a real good example of how you've got to be monitoring these changes, you've got to be looking at the lists, and you've got to be prepared to react quickly if you're going to keep these markets open. The European Union is another one right now where they are revising their standards. And this again could affect the export of processed product as well as fresh product. And it's not as a good news story, because the Koreans are trying to develop their own standards, and they want to base them on science, and they're doing it based on scientific method. That's a pretty straightforward exercise, because then all we need to do is make sure that we can determine what research they need on which chemicals. We work with the registrants, we work with the governments, we get them that, they can make a science-based decision. It's not what Europe's doing. Europe is actually going in a totally different direction than the rest of the world. The rest of the world has decided that we're going to set these chemical residues based on the actual data and a legitimate analysis of whether it proposes a risk to human health. Europe is taking a totally different approach. What they're saying is, if there is any sort of possible hazard, we're going to ban the active ingredient. Now, this is creating some problems for European producers too. It's also entirely inconsistent with international rules, which says you can't just say, well, this is a possible hazard and ban it. You have to identify the actual risk and make your decision based on the risk. The Europeans are saying, no, we're just going to base it on hazard. If there's any hazard at all, then we're going to not allow the product. This could create real problems, not just for those who export processed berries or fresh berries to Europe, but to agricultural producers across the United States who export product to Europe, around the world who export product to Europe, and to European producers. But the European Union is determined to move forward. Now, the recourse is to take them to the World Trade Organization, because this is inconsistent with their obligations under the WTO. This is where the whole uncertainty and the trade battles going back and forth begin to affect it. The United States right now is not doing anything to reinforce the WTO. So the idea that we're going to take another country to the WTO over this, Europe really isn't that scared by that threat. And by the way, the European Union right now is not in any mood to cut us any slack. So this is an area where we're going to have to continue to do what we did with Korea, but where the hoeing is a little bit rougher, and they're less interested in cooperating with us on this. Japan's okay. It has its own national list of standards. It no longer defers to international standards. It began developing in 2006. The one thing you need to be remembering if you are exporting to Japan is that they are most concerned with post-harvest fungicides. And they do test. And they do find violations. There was extensive testing last year. I think there were there have been several hundred violations in the last 3 or 4 years, and there have been a violation or two involving blueberries. So it can happen. And if you are exporting to the Japanese market, I encourage you to pay close attention to the differences between US and Japanese standards, and particularly on anything that might be applied post-harvest. If you get caught twice having violated Japanese standards, then you go onto a list where you have a 100% test and hold, which means everything you ship in will be held and tested before it's released. And that just is something buyers don't find very attractive, so you don't want to get yourself on that list. All of these standards involving post-harvest fungicides or pre-harvest applications are available on the website that BCI manages. It's called globalmrl.com. You can type in Japan and the United States berries, and you'll find out all of the standards for both the countries and where they're different. So as long as you're paying attention to the standards, there shouldn't be any problem, but it's an area where you got to pay attention. China across the board right now is very interesting. This is where we get caught up in a lot of the other drama that's going on. The presidents of the United States and China will be meeting in the next few days in Argentina. There's a lot of hope that we'll be able to resolve some of this tit-for-tat tariff battle that's going on. We're not really caught up in it because there is a tariff that's been applied in China on fresh, but we're not shipping fresh there, so it doesn't really matter. But it affects a lot of these other discussions. And right now, China is in the process of developing their own national standards. They want to issue 10,000 new standards by 2020. Think about that. They want to issue 10,000 new standards by 2020. That means they are pushing out hundreds and thousands of new standards all the time, and that we've got to be monitoring them. The one challenge we have in China, which is different from even the European Union, is that China doesn't, at least right now, have a standard for an import tolerance. Now, an import tolerance is a tolerance a government will set on something they're going to be importing. They don't have a domestic registration because they don't grow that crop or they don't use that active ingredient, so there's no real reason to have a national standard, but they recognize that it's going to be on product coming into their country, so they'll set up an import tolerance. China has no rules under this new system they're developing to set up import tolerances, which means they're only going to be setting tolerances for crops they grow in China and chemicals they use in China. And that's going to create some problems. So we've got to work with the Chinese to figure out how we can develop a system that provides for import tolerances on products they're not growing or on chemicals they're not using in their country. But again, right now, China's not particularly in the mood to work with us on any issue. There are violations that are occasionally found in China. There was one on a fruit product last year. I don't think, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think that there's a systemic science-based approach to testing in China. I think it's a much more politically driven approach, and if they want to create a problem, they'll start testing. If they don't want to create a problem, they let it go. But there's some vulnerabilities there because there are not yet standards for everything that is being used, and we need to make sure that we are working with the Chinese as much as we can in this environment to get the chemical residues that we need approved in China. We've done it in Taiwan. Taiwan had an announcement several years ago. They were going to develop all of their own standards. There were no standards for berries. And over the course of several years, 2 or 3 years, Matt Lance at our office was able to get 77 tolerances that we need in order to export berries fresh and processed to Taiwan. I mean, Matt actually got an award from USDA for the work that he did to make sure that Taiwan established the tolerances that US agricultural exporters need to ship product to that country. Right now, because of the success that some of us have had working with Taiwan, everybody else has seen what's happened. They're figuring out how to do it. The Taiwanese system is sort of overloaded with requests for new ones, and we have a few new ones that we want to get in there. And the system is bogged down because they've kind of figured out, other groups have figured out how to get it done. But we're continuing to work it. In the meantime, there are violations occasionally. Last year, cherries, potatoes, nectarines, grapes, spinach, and a berry product were kicked over. So it's not hypothetical, it's not academic. This happens, and real losses are incurred when it happens. So again, it's critical to look and watch and see, as these chemical residues are changing, that the products that are being applied to the crop are legal in the countries wherever that crop might end up. And then finally, Canada. Canada is our largest market. Canada has often deferred to international or US standards. They've had some of their own. They're beginning to nationalize their system. They are working very closely with EPA, and we're working very closely with Canada. We have had one problem in raspberries, whereas they're developing their own standards, they were giving an exemption to their domestic industry on a chemical. What was it? It was, somebody probably knows. I can't remember. But they had a chemical that was being used by the Canadian raspberry industry. They gave it a special exemption. They did not give that exemption to us. And so the Canadian raspberry industry was able to use a chemical that was not approved for use in the United States, and that created some real trade problems. We have worked with the registrant. We're working with the Canadian government. FMC is the registrant. They have agreed to pull together the data the Canadians need, and we're hoping that as a result, we can level that playing field. But this is another example of where you want to have an environment where the other government wants to work with you. In addition to chemical residues, we're trying to open up some new markets for fresh, and oftentimes we get wrapped around the axle on quarantine negotiations. And that's particularly true in 5 countries, 5 or 6 that we're working on right now. The Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, China, and Australia and New Zealand. And in the Philippines, we got some good news. There's been some road bumps, but I have been told by Matt Lance, who's actually heading up these negotiations for us, that he really is hopeful. I don't think he wants me to announce anything, or he doesn't be held to it, because you never know what's going to happen in these negotiations. But he's pretty hopeful that we will have an agreement to ship fresh berries to the Philippines for the 2019 crop. All of the research has been completed. The Philippines have examined the research that we've provided them on different quarantine issues. They have looked at the 8 pests that they're concerned about that we have here in the United States. They've taken a very science-based approach to it. And Matt believes that we'll be able to negotiate import requirements that are only involve an inspection, no treatment. and that he's hopeful that we can get it done by the 2019 export season. Vietnam is a country where we're trying to, again, open up a market for fresh berries. It has not gone as well as the Philippines. They were supposed to come last July, and then when the United States began pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and create uncertainty in our Southeast Asian trading relations, they began making noise about how they might not come. Then they said they would come only if we agreed to a radiation or a cold storage treatment before shipping there. We said that's a non-starter. And we encouraged them to look at some other alternatives. They finally relented. They came, and now they are beginning to respond that no treatment is likely to be necessary, and that we can negotiate something probably on inspection and pest-free zones. Now, that's what they're saying now. Again, these things can change. They're all fluid. Nothing's ever done till they're done. But there has been real significant progress over the last year with Vietnam, and we hope to have negotiations with them later in 2019. Korea is a market where Oregon has access. Washington and California and other states do not. The other West Coast states are trying to get access to the Korean market. Part of the problem is that when Oregon, we weren't involved in this, but when Oregon got access to the Korean market, they signed an agreement that really wasn't very science-based. It has quarantine issues there involving sudden oak death, which really has nothing to do with blueberries. And the Koreans now want us in Washington and California to accept this same agreement. Well, this agreement really doesn't make sense. So we want to take out those elements that do not make scientific sense and negotiate an agreement that will allow us to ship berries from the West Coast. They want us then to start the whole process all over again for Washington and California, a process that really has already been gone through on these pests for Oregon. It makes no sense. This is a stalling tactic. The fact that they are stalling was raised in US-Korea trade talks in November, and it is raised to the level beyond USDA. It's now in the White House that they need to be moving on issues like berries. The Koreans have said they'll expedite the process. I don't know what that means. It means, I guess, they'll try harder. We'll have to wait and see whether or not they're really serious and whether they come to the table in early 2019 or not. China, we had been making some progress. China is a market where we ship a lot of other very high value products, and people think that we could have a very serious market there. We had quarantine talks going on with the Chinese. They had put together a list of their pests that they were concerned about. We were pulling together data on it. They have already accepted blueberries from Chile and Canada, and the Chileans and the Canadians are beginning to ship product there. Our negotiations with the Chinese have pretty much come to a halt. And until we solve, this goes back to the uncertainty of the larger trade arrangement, until we solve this trade dispute on steel, aluminum, and a lot of other intellectual property issues, I don't think these conversations or negotiations over berries are going to resume. And that's an area where, while we're not directly in the thick of this trade dispute right now between the United States and China, it does have an effect on our ability to ship product around the world. It's probably one of the most uncertain times in some ways that I've ever worked on international trade, but it's also one of the more exciting times because we do have countries engaged in technical standards on chemical residues, on quarantine. They are legitimate scientific talks, and as a result of those talks, you can see in Korea on chemical residues, in the Philippines on quarantine, we are making real headway. And so I think what we gotta do is let the politics play out however they're gonna play out. Let's keep our head down. Let's keep working at the very nuts and bolts level. And I think if we do that, in the next year and the year after that, we'll continue to be able to come here with some good news about new markets that are opening up. Thank you. Yeah, totally.
Anyone? As you've mentioned, these MRLs are constantly changing, and I know on your website you update that right away when you get word of the change. Do you have lead time on these things? Because it's very difficult with the processed product, and when you're making, plans for sales and trade. So is there a way that you can give lead time to these upcoming adjustments?
We do. Thank you, because that's something I kind of skipped over and I'd like to talk about. We're monitoring at BCI. We're monitoring these changes on a day-to-day basis. But we're not just monitoring the changes that have come into effect. We're looking at the changes that countries are planning and try to work with them 18 to 24 months out if we're getting that much notice. And sometimes we do get notice 18, 24, 12 months out. If that's the case and we see that there's a problem, as was the case with Korea when we saw last year in October that we didn't have any standards at all, then we'll jump into action if we're retained by that group to do it and begin to work with the registrants and the foreign governments and the US government to get the standards we need. So it's not just, this is what changed today. We're trying to give growers the opportunity to look at what's coming down the pike so that if they're trying to make decisions about what they're going to apply to their crop and they know where that crop might end up in the fall, they can begin changing their spray regime in the spring to accommodate changes that might be coming down them.
Bill, could you elaborate a little bit on your sense of sampling protocols and percentages in foreign ports and also here stateside, and what are there comparisons?
It depends on the country on whether or not there are comparisons. In the United States, we sample a lot, but when you look at how much is actually coming in, the percentage is not that high. But we and a lot of other countries don't just, some randomly sample, but I think authorities also have a good appreciation of where there are likely to be trouble spots or where they've had problems or violations in the past, and they'll focus on product coming from those countries that have had problems perhaps more than they would otherwise. That's why it's best to stay off these lists, because once you do have a violation, then it's more likely you're going to be tested more severely than if you've never had a violation in the past. When I started out, in the 80s, well, in the 80s, we really weren't dealing with chemical residues that much, but certainly in the 90s and the beginning of the century, when a lot of these countries began developing their own systems, we had oftentimes some real questions about, okay, what was the protocol? How did this test happen or occur? I can remember a few countries where they would tell me that they conducted a certain test, which I knew required instrumentation that they probably didn't have in their laboratory, and we would have to deal with that. That doesn't happen very much anymore. They've built pretty sophisticated labs. They have sophisticated scientists, and in most countries, they understand what they need to be doing.
Could you say something about the what's going on between the U.S. and Canada? Because it's kind of a co-op. Oh, sorry. Over here. It's kind of a complicated situation that it's cooperative with our industries and at the same time competitive. Are you working on that at all?
Yeah, that's a good summary. We have a very good relationship with the Canadians, but it's still at times a competitive one. This whole issue over the raspberry deal is, I think, an example of that, where you're providing an emergency exemption to the domestic industry in Canada, but not extending that to the United States. On the whole, when it comes to these chemical issues, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand work very closely together. It's called the Quad, and they try and cooperate on international standards. The Canadians work very closely with EPA. A lot of times now we will do joint reviews of a new active ingredient or chemical at the same time. So while each country is setting their own standards, they're doing it based on the same analysis, so they should come to similar or the same conclusions. So actually how the United States and Canada, while we are competitors, how we're working on these regulatory issues could be a model for other countries. There are always bumps and problems, and we focus on those, but overwhelmingly it works out.
Hey, Bill, I got a question. This is from folks in Prosser. Why is it that Japan is most concerned with post-harvest fungicides?
I don't know, but across the board, Japan tends to be, and this is sort of just my opinion, that wasn't been documented anywhere, but in my experience, Japan is very focused on post-harvest treatments more than pre-harvest, and I'm not quite sure why.
Question. Hi, Bill.
Hey.
Hey, I have a question about tariffs. I know you were talking more about technical and chemical issues, but a lot of the concerns that the U.S. industry has had is that our tariffs are giving us a competitive disadvantage as our global competitors in other countries are arranging free trade agreements. What do you think our chances are to lower tariffs given the current environment? Sorry, did I stump you?
No. I'm trying to be political. The best opportunity we had to reduce tariffs throughout Asia and a lot of these markets where we're working on the quarantine side, and if we get the quarantine regulations removed, we'll then have tariffs. The best way we could have removed the tariffs even before we got the quarantine ones resolved, so that when we got the quarantine resolved, we were ready to rock and roll, would have been the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because it really reduced tariffs in these markets across the board for agriculture. The United States gave up a lot of, you guys know this, gave up a lot of our agricultural tariffs in the 1960s and 70s in different negotiations. We were very competitive in agriculture, the rest of the world wasn't, so we weren't that concerned, so we lowered a lot of our tariffs. A lot of the other countries were still much more ag dependent, and so they kept their tariffs up and gave us manufacturing cuts. Well, now we got a situation where we have a lot of high tariffs or relatively high tariffs in a lot of these countries. The Trans-Pacific Partnership in Asia leveled a lot of that. And so what we have to do now that the United States has pulled out is we've got to go to each of those countries individually and try and renegotiate those concessions. That takes a lot of manpower, it takes a lot of time, and the other countries really aren't willing to do it because they're like, we've already done this once. So we've put ourselves at more of a competitive disadvantage than we should have. Yeah, it's off, yeah. In Germany. The question was, you know, a lot of this very different tack that the European Union is taking on chemical residues and a lot of other things is really being driven out of the Scandinavian, France, Germany countries. And if Europe, if the UK pulls out, will that cause them to kind of reflect on what they're doing and maybe reassess? Is that a fair, okay. No, I don't think it will cause them to reassess at all. And if anything, it might actually empower them, because the UK was always one of the voices there trying to say, well, wait, this isn't consistent with our scientific obligations, or this isn't consistent with the rest of the world, and this isn't the way we would be doing it if we really wanted to focus on trade. And the Green parties in Germany and a lot of these more popular parties in Scandinavia and other parts of Europe are always the one kind of pushing back, saying, well, we're going to do our own thing. Without that UK voice there, it might actually embolden them just to move forward in the way they want to move forward. All right, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Hey, I neglected to say that Bill's appearance here was sponsored by Whatcom Family Farmers, and I want to give them credit, and I hope that most of you will spend some time getting over to their booth. Way in the far corner, northwest corner, stop by there. You're a family farmer here in Whatcom County. Please stop and talk with them a little bit about it. So last words. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. You guys do a great work for us, all of us in the berry industry. Final instructions, Chris?
Lunch is ready, so you can head over. Basic, same design as yesterday, 2 options. You can go to both of them if you want. And we'll start up again at 1:30.
Thank you all.